October 732. The road to Tours is open. A raid army, fast, confident, hungry for loot, has been burning its way north, and the richest prize is ahead. But on a cold ridge between Tours and Poitiers, Charles Martel does something that looks insane. He doesn't charge, he doesn't chase, he makes his men lock shields and stand still. Because he knows one thing: if this line breaks even once, the raid pours through like water. So the Franks become a wall, shoulder to shoulder. Shields pressed tight, spears braced. The enemy hits, again and again, expecting panic. And then the moment happens. The line doesn't move. Not a step. Let's go back. Because what happens on that ridge doesn't make sense unless you understand what's already been lost. The year is 711. The Umayyad Caliphate, one of the most powerful empires on earth, crosses from North Africa into Iberia. Within 7 years, almost the entire peninsula falls. Kingdoms collapse. Cities surrender. The speed is terrifying. But they don't stop at the Pyrenees. Raiding parties push north into Francia, testing, probing, taking what they can carry. And in 732, a massive expedition drives deep, deeper than ever before. The target? Tours, a city packed with church treasures, trade wealth, everything an army on the move dreams about. The commander leading this force is Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, experienced, disciplined. He's not some reckless warlord. He's the governor of Al-Andalus, and he's brought an army that knows how to move fast and hit hard. They've already crushed one major obstacle: Duke Odo of Aquitaine. Odo is the local power in southwestern Francia. He's supposed to be the shield against raids from the south. He's fought them before, even made alliances when it suited him. But this time, the numbers aren't in his favor. Abd al-Rahman's force smashes through Odo's army near Bordeaux, scattering it like leaves. Odo runs, not in shame, in desperation, because he knows one thing: he can't stop. This alone. So he does something that must taste like poison. He goes north, to the one man in Francia who might have the strength to stand against what's coming. Charles Martel. Now, Charles and Odo? They hate each other. Years earlier, Charles invaded Odo's lands, humiliated him, forced him into submission. Odo has every reason to let Charles face this problem alone and watch him burn. But here's the thing about existential threats. They make enemies into allies real fast. Odo arrives at Charles' court with nothing but bad news and a single question. Can you stop them? Charles doesn't answer right away, because Charles Martel, the Hammer, isn't some king. He's the mayor of the palace, essentially the power behind the Frankish throne, a military commander who's spent decades fighting civil wars, rival claimants, and external threats. He's brutal, he's calculating, and he knows that if this raid reaches the heart of Francia unchecked, everything he's built collapses, so he makes the call. He gathers his army, veterans from years of grinding campaigns, men who know how to march, how to dig in, how to hold a line when it's easier to run. He calls in forces from across his territories. It takes time, precious time, while Abd al-Rahman's army is still moving north. But Charles isn't panicking, because he's already thinking 3 moves ahead. He knows he can't fight them in open ground, not the way they fight. The Umayyad force is built around speed, light cavalry, mobile infantry, hit-and-run tactics perfected over decades of conquest. In a flat field, they flow around obstacles, exploit gaps, strike flanks before you realize you have flanks. Charles has seen what happens to armies that try to match that kind of mobility. They get carved apart. So he makes a choice that will define everything. He's not going to fight their fight. He's going to make them fight his. The place he picks is a ridge between Tours and Poitiers. It's not dramatic. No towering, cliffs or narrow passes. But it has exactly what Charles needs. High ground, trees, limited frontal approach. Cavalry needs space to accelerate, to build momentum, to hit with the full weight of horse and rider crashing into flesh. Take that away, and suddenly the advantage flips. The ridge forces any attacking force to come uphill through broken terrain into a line that can see them coming. Charles positions his army in a dense formation, shields overlapping, spears angled forward, no fancy maneuvers, no clever flanking plans, just a wall of men locked together, immovable. And then he waits, because Charles understands something about battles that most commanders miss. Sometimes the best move is to force your enemy to make the first mistake. Abd al-Rahman arrives and sees the Frankish army on the ridge, and he has a problem. His force is built for raiding, fast strikes, quick victories, taking plunder and moving before any organized defense can form. But now there's an organized defense, a big one, dug into high ground, not moving. He could try to go around them, push on to Tours, but that leaves a hostile army at his back, ready to cut his supply lines, trap him in unfamiliar territory. He could retreat, take what loot he's already gathered, and head south. But that looks like defeat, undermines his authority, wastes the entire campaign. So he chooses the third option. Break them. Just break the line. Shatter it with repeated charges. Force them to panic, to crack, to run. It's worked before. It should work now. Except Charles isn't planning to move. For days, they face each other. Skirmishing, testing, neither side willing to fully commit. Think about what that feels like for the soldiers. You're standing in formation, watching enemy riders probe your flanks, hearing the shouts, the clatter of metal, the occasional scream when someone gets caught out of position. Your legs ache. Your shield feels heavier every hour. You eat cold rations and try to sleep while knowing that tomorrow, or maybe tonight, the real fight begins. The Chronicle of 754, written just 20 years later, describes it as both armies tormenting each other for days before the main clash. The tension is unbearable. Every moment feels like the one where everything explodes. And then, finally, it does. The order comes. Abd al-Rahman commits his cavalry. They come uphill in waves, hooves pounding, dust rising. The sound alone is enough to make men want to run, a rolling thunder of violence aimed straight at you. The Frankish line tightens, shields lock, boots dig into the dirt, and the first wave hits. The impact is everything. Imagine standing shoulder to shoulder with men you've marched with for weeks. And suddenly the world becomes noise and pressure. Horses scream, riders shout, spears crack against shields. The line shudders, metal grinding against wood, weight pressing forward. And for a split second, you feel it start to give. But it doesn't. Break. Because breaking requires someone to step back first. And if you step back, the man next to you dies. And if he dies, the gap opens. And if the gap opens, cavalry pours through and everyone behind you, everyone, gets run down like animals. So you don't step back. You push your shoulder into your shield. You brace your feet. You feel the man beside you doing the same thing, and the man beside him, and suddenly you're not individuals anymore. You're a single thing. A wall made of flesh and iron and terror and discipline. The cavalry hits again. Harder this time. Riders trying to find a weak point, a place where the line is thinner, where panic might be taking root. They wheel and strike, expecting the inevitable, the moment when fear wins and the formation collapses. It doesn't come. Here's what makes this impossible. Cavalry charges work because they look unstoppable. The psychology is brutal. You see 1,000 pounds of muscle and metal thundering toward you, and every instinct in your body screams, "Run!" Armies break before the charge even hits because men make the rational choice. Save yourself, scatter, survive. But the Franks don't scatter. They've been trained for this. Not just trained to fight, trained to not move, to hold the line even when everything inside you is begging to bolt. Charles has built an army that understands one truth: the only safety is in the wall. Step out of it, and you're dead. Stay in it, and you might live. So they stay. The Umayyad cavalry hits them again, and again. Each charge expecting the break that never comes. Riders get tangled in the trees on the flanks. Horses stumble on the uneven ground. The momentum they need to shatter infantry just isn't there. The terrain Charles chose is doing exactly what he designed it to do. It's turning their greatest weapon into a liability, and slowly, the equation changes. Let's talk about what Abd al-Rahman is seeing from his position. He's watching his cavalry, his elite force, the tip of his spear, crash into a line that refuses to move. Every charge costs him men and horses. Every failed breakthrough drains morale. And the Franks? They're just standing there, taking losses, sure, but not breaking, not routing, not giving him the collapse he needs. This is the nightmare scenario for a raiding army, because raids are about speed and shock. You hit hard, take what you can, and vanish before the enemy organizes. But now the enemy is organized, dug in, immovable, and every hour this drags on, Abd al-Rahman's advantage slips away. His supply lines are stretched, his men are tired, the loot they've collected is sitting in camps that are now vulnerable, and winter is coming. Staying in hostile territory when the weather turns is a death sentence. But he can't just walk away. Not after committing this hard, not after losing men in failed charges. Retreat now looks like defeat, and defeat undermines everything: his authority, his reputation, the entire campaign's purpose. So he keeps trying to break them. The battle stretches into hours. The Frankish line holds. Men fall. Of course they do. Spears find gaps in armor. Axes split shields. Blood soaks into the cold ground, but the line doesn't collapse. New men step forward to fill the gaps. The wall stays solid. And then, as the sun starts to drop, something shifts. Historians argue about the exact sequence of events. The sources are thin, written years later, sometimes contradictory. But here's what seems to have happened. Abd al-Rahman dies during the fighting. Whether it's a spear, an arrow, a desperate melee, we don't know. But the commander, the man holding this entire force together, goes down. And in an army held together by personal loyalty and immediate leadership, that's catastrophic. Suddenly the question isn't, can we break them? It's, who's in charge now? Confusion spreads. Orders conflict. The pressure on the Frankish line eases not because the Umayyad force is beaten, but because they're no longer coordinated. Night falls, the fighting stops. Both sides pull back, exhausted, bloodied, trying to make sense of what just happened. The Franks hold their position, waiting for dawn, waiting to see if the enemy regroups and comes again. But when dawn comes, the camps are empty. Frankish scouts advance cautiously, expecting an ambush, a trick, something. But there's no trap. The Umayyad force has withdrawn during the night, pulled back south with whatever loot they could carry, leaving behind the dead and the dreams of taking Tours. It's over. Not because the Franks chased them down. Not because of some brilliant flanking maneuver or heroic cavalry charge, but because Charles made them fight a battle they couldn't win, a battle where all their advantages turned into weaknesses, and the only thing that mattered was who could stand still longer. The impossible just happened. A raid army that had crushed everything in its path, that moved faster than any defense could form, that seemed unstoppable, stopped by a wall that refused to move. Let's zoom out for a second, because in the moment, the soldiers on that ridge don't know. They just fought one of history's most famous battles. They're cold, exhausted, and trying to figure out if they're going to get paid. But the ripples of this fight spread fast. Charles' reputation explodes. The man who stopped the Umayyad expansion, the hammer who stood between Francia and conquest. His power base solidifies. The enemies who might have challenged him suddenly reconsider, and his family, the Carolingians, rise to dominate European politics for generations. His grandson will be Charlemagne. For Odo, it's survival. His lands are saved. His authority is diminished. He's clearly the junior partner now. But he's alive and his duchy survives. Sometimes that's the only victory that matters. And for the Umayyad forces, they pull back south. The raids into deep, Francia largely stop. Not because they couldn't come back, they absolutely could, but because the cost-benefit equation has changed. There are easier targets, richer prizes, less organized resistance elsewhere. Tours becomes the high watermark, the furthest point north the expansion reaches. Not the end of Muslim presence in Iberia that lasts for centuries, but the end of the dream of pushing into the Frankish heartland. Now here's where we need to pump the brakes on the mythology. Because over the centuries, this battle gets inflated. Later chroniclers, especially during the Crusades, turn it into an apocalyptic clash between Christianity and Islam, with Charles as the savior of Europe and the fate of Western civilization hanging in the balance. The numbers balloon to absurd levels. Some accounts claim hundreds of thousands of fighters on each side, which is logistically impossible for 8th century armies. The reality is murkier and smaller. We don't know exactly how many men fought. Probably a few thousand on each side. Maybe more, maybe less. We don't have detailed tactical descriptions. We don't know the precise terrain features or where every unit stood. The Chronicle of 754 is the closest contemporary source, and it's brief and vague. What we do know is this: a Frankish army under Charles Martel fought a Umayyad raiding force near Tours, held their position through a brutal day of fighting, and the raiders withdrew after their commander died. That's it. That's the bedrock. Everything else, the legends, the significance, the grand narrative gets built on top later. But here's the thing. Even stripped of mythology, the battle still matters. Not because it saved Europe in some grand, inevitable way, but because it showed something tactical that would echo through medieval warfare for centuries. Disciplined infantry, properly positioned, could stop cavalry. That's the lesson. Not glory, not destiny, just cold, hard military reality. Let's talk about what discipline actually means when you're standing in that line. Because discipline sounds abstract, noble, like something generals talk about in planning tents. But on the ground, in the moment, discipline is the thing fighting every survival instinct you have. You're standing in formation, the charge is coming. Your brain is screaming at you to run because running is smart. Running is how you survive when a predator is coming. Every ancestor you have that survived to pass down genes did it by running from things that wanted to kill them. But you don't run. Why? Not because you're braver than your ancestors. Not because you've transcended fear. You don't run because the man next to you isn't running. And the man next to him isn't running. And you've spent weeks, months, maybe years training with these men. And the shame of being the one who breaks, the one who gets everyone killed, that shame is somehow worse than the horse bearing down on you. That's discipline. It's not courage. It's social pressure weaponized. Charles understands this. He's built an army where the scariest thing isn't the enemy. It's letting down the men beside you. And on that ridge, that psychology becomes the difference between a battle and a massacre. But let's be honest about something else. Holding the line costs blood. Men die, a lot of them. When cavalry hits infantry, even disciplined infantry, people get crushed. Spears punch through mail and leather. Axes crack skulls. Horses collapse onto soldiers, pinning them, breaking bones. The front ranks take horrific casualties. The sources don't give us numbers, but medieval combat was brutal and personal. You're not firing from a distance. You're close enough to smell the enemy. to see their eyes, to hear them die. And the thing about shield walls is that when someone in the front rank falls, someone else has to step forward into that gap immediately. Every moment of hesitation is a crack the cavalry can exploit. So soldiers are constantly shuffling forward, filling holes, knowing that stepping into a gap probably means dying in the next 30 seconds. The Franks do it anyway. Not because they're superhuman, because they're trapped in a system where the only options are hold or die, and holding gives you at least a chance. That's the reality under the legend. Blood and terror and men making the least bad choice over and over until the sun goes down. So why does Abd al-Rahman keep ordering charges when they're clearly not working? Good question. And the answer tells you something about medieval warfare that doesn't fit the Hollywood version. Commanders don't have perfect information. Abd al-Rahman can't see the entire battlefield. He sees his cavalry hit the line, sees fighting, sees casualties on both sides. What he doesn't see clearly is whether the line is weakening. Is it about to break? Is one more charge going to do it? In his experience, infantry formations break. That's what they do. You hit them hard enough, long enough, and fear does the rest. The panic spreads, someone runs, the formation collapses, and then it's a slaughter. He's waiting for that moment. Every commander in his position would wait for that moment. Because the alternative, accepting that you can't break them and withdrawing, means admitting you've lost men for nothing. It means your entire strategy was wrong. And humans, especially leaders, are really bad at accepting that in real time. So he keeps trying, adjusting angles of attack, sending in fresh waves, probing for weak spots. Surely there's a point where they break. But there isn't. And with every failed charge, his position gets worse. Men are tired. Horses are exhausted. Morale is cracking. And then he goes down. And suddenly there's no central authority to decide what happens next. That's when the withdrawal becomes inevitable. Let's imagine that night after the fighting stops. The Frankish soldiers are still in formation. They don't celebrate. They don't even know if they've won. For all they know, the enemy is regrouping in the dark, preparing for another assault at dawn. They tend to wounds. They count the dead. They try to eat something, though most are too exhausted and terrified to have much appetite. Sleep comes in shifts. Some men rest while others watch the tree line, straining to hear movement in the darkness. Charles moves through the ranks. He's not a king giving inspiring speeches. He's a commander making sure his men know the plan, hold position, stay ready, don't break formation even if you think it's over, because it might not be over. Meanwhile, in the Umayyad camps, chaos is spreading. Abd al-Rahman is dead. Leadership is fractured. Different commanders have different ideas about what to do next. Some want to regroup and attack again. Others point out the obvious. They're deep in hostile territory. Their commander is gone, winter is coming, and they're fighting an enemy that won't break. The argument for withdrawal wins. Not because anyone's a coward. These are veteran soldiers who've conquered kingdoms, but because the math has changed. This was supposed to be a raid, not a siege. Take the loot, hit the target, get out. Now they're stuck in a grinding battle against an enemy that refuses to do what enemies are supposed to do. So they pack up, they take what they can carry, and they move south under cover of darkness, quickly, before the Franks realize what's happening and try to pursue. Dawn breaks. Frankish scouts advance. Can you imagine that moment? You've been standing in formation all night, every muscle tense, waiting for the attack that will decide if you live or die. And then the scouts come back with impossible news. They're gone. Not hiding, not regrouping. Gone. The relief must be overwhelming, but also confusing. Did we win? Did they retreat? What just happened? Charles doesn't let them dwell on it. He orders the army to advance cautiously, secure the abandoned camps, and make sure this isn't some elaborate trap. It's not. The enemy has genuinely withdrawn, And that's when the realization starts to sink in. We held. Against everything, against impossible odds, we held. The line didn't break. Here's where the story gets mythologized fast. Within years, chroniclers are writing about the Battle of Tours, or Poitiers. Even the name gets disputed. And the details start to shift. Numbers grow. The stakes get inflated. What was a significant raid and a defensive victory becomes an apocalyptic showdown between civilizations. Charles becomes the hammer who saved Christendom. The Umayyad force becomes an unstoppable horde turned back by divine intervention and Frankish valor. Why does this happen? Because people need their history to mean something big. A defensive victory against a raiding force is impressive, but it doesn't have the same narrative power as the battle that saved Europe. And look, there's truth in the significance. The battle does matter. Charles' reputation skyrockets. The political landscape of Francia shifts. The Umayyad expansion north effectively stops here. Those are real consequences. But we need to be careful about claiming too much. The Umayyad Caliphate doesn't collapse. Islam doesn't retreat from Iberia. It stays for another 7 centuries. And raids across the Pyrenees, while reduced, don't completely stop. History is messier than the neat narratives we like to tell. What Tours proves isn't that one side was destined to win. It proves that tactics, terrain, and discipline can overcome momentum and mobility. That's the real lesson. And honestly, that's more useful than any grand narrative about civilizations clashing. Let's go deeper into the tactical innovation here, because it's genuinely brilliant. Medieval warfare is dominated by cavalry for a reason. Mounted warriors are fast, flexible, and terrifying. They can charge, retreat, reposition, and charge again. Infantry, by contrast, is slow, vulnerable, easy to flank. So how do you beat cavalry with infantry? You take away their advantages. Cavalry needs space to accelerate. Put them in tight terrain, forests, hills, narrow approaches, and they can't build the speed that makes their charge devastating. Cavalry needs gaps to exploit. Give them a solid, unbroken line with no flanks to turn, and they're just riding into a wall of spears over and over. Cavalry relies on infantry panicking. Train your men to hold formation no matter what, and suddenly the charge that's supposed to shatter you just doesn't. Charles figures all this out. Or maybe he learns it from earlier battles. Or maybe he gets lucky and the terrain happens to favor his strengths. Whatever the source, he executes it perfectly. He picks ground that limits cavalry mobility. He builds a formation that has no obvious weak points. He drills his men to hold the line even when every instinct says run. And then he makes the enemy come to him, forcing them to fight on his terms. It's not flashy. There's no dramatic cavalry charge by the Franks, no clever ambush, no heroic duel between champions, just men standing in place, refusing to move until the enemy runs out of options. And it works. Here's what makes Charles Martel different from most commanders of his era. He doesn't care about looking heroic. Think about medieval warfare's cultural expectations. Glory comes from the charge, from aggression, from leading your knights in a thunderous assault that breaks the enemy through sheer courageous violence. That's what songs get written about. Charles says, no. He builds a strategy around not doing the exciting thing, around standing still while the enemy exhausts themselves, around winning through patience instead of heroic action. It's deeply unsexy as far as medieval warfare goes, but it wins. And winning is what builds power, not songs, not glory. Charles doesn't need to be Achilles. He just needs to be the man still, standing when it's over. Let's talk about what happens to Duke Odo after this. Remember, Odo came to Charles in desperation after his army got smashed. He's forced to ally with a man he hates, watch that man win the victory Odo couldn't, and live with the consequences. Those consequences are brutal for his pride. Charles is now clearly the dominant power in Francia. Odo's autonomy is gone. He's a subordinate, dependent on Charles for protection. Whatever dreams he had of ruling independently, finished. But here's the trade. He's alive. His lands are intact. His people aren't being raided. Sometimes survival is the only victory available. Odo swallows his pride because the alternative is being destroyed by the next raid with no one to call. Battles don't just determine who wins the fight. They reshape entire political landscapes. Charles doesn't just defeat a raid. He consolidates power over rival nobles and sets up his family to dominate Francia for generations. Now, the elephant. In the room, the religious angle. Later, Christian chroniclers frame Tours as a religious war, Christianity versus Islam. Charles as defender of Christendom against the infidel horde. How much is real? Some, but probably less than legends claim. Yes, Abd al-Rahman's force is Muslim. Yes, Charles' army is Christian. Religion matters in medieval warfare. It shapes alliances, provides justification, affects treatment of prisoners. But this specific battle, it's primarily a raid and a defense. Abd al-Rahman isn't converting Francia. He's taking loot and territory, same goals any medieval commander would have. Charles isn't fighting a holy war. He's defending his power base and preventing plunder. The religious framing gets added later, especially during the Crusades when Europeans need historical precedents of righteous warfare against Muslims. Tours becomes a perfect story. The faithful stood firm, and God delivered victory. That narrative has power. It shapes how people think about history, identity, civilization. But it's not what the men on that ridge were thinking about. They were thinking, don't let the line break, don't die, hold until sunset. The theology comes later. Let's get tactical again. The Shieldwall is exhausting. You're not just standing there, you're actively pressing forward against cavalry weight. Your shield isn't resting. You're holding it up, braced against your shoulder, angled to deflect impacts. Your spear extended, ready to thrust. Every muscle engaged, legs locked to prevent being pushed back, core tight for balance, arms burning from holding shield and weapons steady, and you can't rest. The moment you relax, the moment your shield drops an inch, that's when a spear finds your throat. Minutes stretch into hours. The physical toll is immense. This is why training matters. Untrained men collapse from exhaustion before the enemy breaks them. Charles' veterans have the endurance to maintain that brutal exertion all day. That's the real weapon. Not individual skill, not better equipment. Just the ability to keep doing the painful, exhausting thing longer than the enemy expects. Here's a question. What if Abd al-Rahman hadn't died? Would the battle have ended differently? Would he have found a way to break the line? Or would he have withdrawn earlier, preserving his force? We'll never know. But his death is the pivot point. It transforms a tactical stalemate into strategic defeat. Medieval armies are personal. Soldiers follow commanders they know, trust, respect. They're not serving abstract nations. They're serving this specific leader. When that leader dies, the glue dissolves. Suddenly, every sub-commander is making their own decisions. Do we avenge him? Withdraw? Elect a new leader right now in hostile territory? The paralysis is fatal. If Abd al-Rahman survives, maybe he makes an organized withdrawal at dusk, declares the raid a success despite missing Tours. Maybe he tries again next year with better tactics. But he doesn't survive. And that changes everything. Sometimes history turns on individual moments of chaos. A spear finds a gap. A commander goes down. The campaign collapses. It's not destiny. It's brutal, random chance. Zoom forward a few decades. Charles Martel dies in 741, less than a decade after Tours. His son, Pepin the Short, becomes king. And Pepin's son? Charlemagne. The man who builds an empire, gets crowned Holy Roman Emperor, dominates European politics for generations. None of that happens if Charles loses at Tours. If the raid succeeds, if the Franks break, if Charles dies or flees, the Carolingian dynasty might never rise. Someone else fills that vacuum. Maybe Odo becomes dominant, maybe Francia fragments, maybe the Umayyads establish permanent presence north of the Pyrenees. We don't know what that alternate timeline looks like, but we know it's different. Tours doesn't save Europe. That's too grand. But it ensures Charles Martel's lineage becomes Francia's dominant force, and that has ripple effects for centuries. History pivots on battles, deaths, decisions made in chaos. Tours is one of those pivots. Here's the most uncomfortable truth. We don't actually know that much about Tours. The Chronicle of 754 gives us the outline. Other sources, written later, add details. But how reliable? How much is memory? Embellishment? Invention? We don't know exact troop numbers. We don't know precise tactics beyond defensive position. We don't know how many charges or how long each lasted. We don't even know for certain where Abd al-Rahman died. Combat? Camp? Battle wounds or assassination? The uncertainty is frustrating. But honest. History isn't a neat story. It's fragments, educated guesses, and lots of probably and likely and according to possibly biased sources. What we can say with confidence, a Frankish army under Charles engaged a Umayyad raiding force near Tours, held ground through sustained combat, and the raiders withdrew after their commander died. Everything else, the drama, the details, the meaning, we construct from limited evidence. That doesn't make it less important, just more human. Let's bring this home. Because the real lesson of Tours isn't about religion or civilization or destiny. It's about something much more practical. Steel wins duels. Discipline wins history. Individual courage matters in hand-to-hand combat. But battles, real battles that reshape kingdoms, are won by men who can do the boring, terrifying thing over and over without breaking. Stand in formation. Hold the line. Don't run when every instinct screams at you to run. Do it for hours. Do it while men die around you. Do it because the alternative is worse. That's what wins at Tours. Not heroism, not divine intervention, just brutal, unglamorous discipline executed perfectly. Think about what Charles achieved with that single decision to stand still. He took an army that was slower, less mobile, and less experienced in this kind of warfare, and he made those weaknesses irrelevant. He didn't try to beat the Umayyad force at their own game. He changed the game entirely. Can't match their speed? Pick terrain where speed doesn't matter. Can't match their cavalry? Build a formation cavalry can't break. Can't win a war of maneuver? Force them into a battle of endurance. It's strategic brilliance disguised as stubbornness. And it works because Charles understands his own strengths and limitations better than his opponent does. That's generalship. Not flashy tactics or dramatic gambits. Just cold assessment of what you have versus what they have, and finding the one battlefield condition where your advantages matter more than theirs. But let's not romanticize the cost. The Frankish casualties at Tours are significant. We don't have exact numbers, but holding a defensive position against repeated cavalry charges means men die. A lot of men. Families lose fathers, sons, brothers, communities. Lose workers, leaders, protectors. The victory is real, but it's paid for in blood and grief. And here's the thing about medieval warfare that we forget. Most soldiers aren't professional warriors. They're farmers, craftsmen, laborers who get called up when their lord needs an army. They fight, they survive or don't, and if they survive, they go home and try to rebuild their lives with whatever trauma and injuries they carry. The chronicles don't record their names. History remembers Charles Martel, maybe mentions Abd al-Rahman, and forgets the thousands of men who actually stood in that line and bled. That's worth remembering. The victory belongs to them as much as to Charles. Maybe more. So what happens to the Umayyad presence in Europe after Tours? They don't disappear. That's crucial to understand. Muslim rule in Iberia continues for centuries. Al-Andalus becomes one of the most sophisticated, culturally rich territories in medieval Europe. Centers of learning, architectural marvels, advances in mathematics, medicine, philosophy, all flourish there. And raids across the Pyrenees don't completely stop. They're just smaller, more cautious, less ambitious. The calculation has changed. Deep strikes into Francia are too costly, too risky. But border conflicts, smaller expeditions, political maneuvering, all continue. Tours isn't the end of Islamic expansion in Europe. It's just the end of one particular type of expansion, the large-scale raids aimed at Francia's heartland. The border stabilizes, more or less. Both sides realize they can't easily conquer the other, so they settle into a pattern of occasional conflict, occasional trade, occasional alliances when it serves mutual interests. That's how history actually works, not clean victories and total defeats, just messy, shifting boundaries and pragmatic accommodations. Here's what the battle teaches military commanders for the next 1,000 years. Infantry can beat cavalry if you do 3 things right. First, pick terrain that limits cavalry mobility. Hills, forests, marshes, narrow passes, anywhere horses can't build speed or maneuver freely. Second, maintain formation discipline. One gap, one moment of panic, and cavalry pours through. But an unbroken line is nearly impossible to crack. Third, force the enemy to attack you. Make them exhaust themselves trying to break your position instead of using their mobility to attack where you're weak. Do those 3 things, and suddenly the inferior force has the advantage. This lesson gets refined and repeated throughout medieval warfare. English longbowmen at Crécy and Agincourt combine it with missile fire. Swiss pikemen turn it into an art form. Terrain and discipline become the equalizers that let infantry-heavy armies compete with mounted knights. Tours is one of the first major demonstrations of the principle. And commanders study it for centuries because the lesson is timeless. Control the battlefield conditions, and you control the outcome. Let's address one final myth: the idea that Tours saved Western civilization. It's a compelling narrative. The unstoppable Muslim expansion gets halted at Tours, preserving Christian Europe, allowing the development of Western culture as we know it. But it's too simple. First, Western civilization isn't a fragile thing that lives or dies based on one battle. It's a complex web of cultures, ideas, technologies, and peoples that evolves through countless interactions and conflicts. Second, Islamic civilization isn't an alien force trying to destroy Europe. It's a sophisticated culture that preserves Greek philosophy, advances mathematics and medicine, and influences European development in countless ways, including after Tours. Third, the Umayyads weren't trying to conquer and permanently hold all of Francia. They were raiding, taking wealth, expanding influence where profitable. Tours stops one raid, not an existential threat to European existence. The clash of civilizations framing is more about later centuries trying to make sense of their own conflicts than about what actually happened in 732. What Tours actually saves is Charles Martel's political power. What it actually stops is Umayyad raids into deep Francia. What it actually proves is that disciplined infantry can hold defensive positions against cavalry. Those are significant, but they're not the same as saving civilization. So here we are. October 732. A cold ridge between Tours and Poitiers. 2 armies face each other. One fast, experienced, confident. One slower, dug in, determined. The cavalry charges. The line holds. Again, and again, and again. Hours pass. Men die. The ground turns muddy with blood. The impossible keeps happening. The wall refuses to break. Night falls. A commander dies. Confusion spreads. Dawn reveals empty camps. And just like that, it's over. Not because of destiny or divine will or civilizational superiority. Because Charles Martel understood that the best way to stop a force built on momentum is to become unmovable. Because Frankish soldiers held formation when everything inside them screamed to run. Because sometimes the winning move is the boring one. Stand your ground and make the enemy exhaust themselves trying to move you. They didn't stop the raid army by chasing it. They stopped it by refusing to move. Not a step,